So how do you prepare? You've got this interview lined up. You've got a really great interview lined up for Thursday. How do you start to get yourself prepared for it in these ways? And I'll tell you a little bit about it. So one of the things when I started to do a lot more interviews is I started a podcast. When I started doing a podcast, the first one, I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be totally easy. I read some stuff and I sat down with the interview, and it was sort of a fairly biggish kind of author, and I sat down and we went through the interview and we got off in the end, and he goes, that really wasn't that good of an interview. And I was like, wow, that's really rough. I mean, thankfully we knew each other, so he could say those sort of things, but he told me it wasn't very good. And I was like, wow, that's sort of biting that you would tell me that one. He's like, yeah, listen, it just felt like we didn't really have a point to it. And so I think the important thing to understand is when you prepare for an interview, you want to go in so that it feels like you're having a point to the interview. So here's some of the things that I always tell people is like, when you want to start to do some research on someone, go in with a point. Find something you can find about them. So I want to tell you a little bit about, one of the things we talked about last week was this idea of secondary interviews. So you should think about, before you sit down with anyone to do an interview with them, a primary one, can you do a secondary interview? So can you find out, for example, if you get the good fortune to interview the founder of Pixar, could you understand what he talks about already? What has he said out there? What are some of his backgrounds? So remember these things we talked about earlier that we do last week. You can actually prepare for an interview very well by doing a light secondary interview. And here's the best part of doing that. If you do this secondary interview where you go out and see where they worked, you see some quotes they have other places, well then you don't need to cover those things. You will already be able to use those things in your book. You'll cite it properly. So in that case, we know that the founder of Pixar has written a book called Creativity, Inc. If there's a really great story in the beginning, and I think it's interesting, but I don't need to tell anymore, I said, hey, listen, I love the interview that you gave in the book talking about creativity. I just had kind of a follow-up question on it. I wanted to go deeper. Well, what you can do now is you don't necessarily have to sit there and cover all the stuff that's covered elsewhere. You can cover what just matters to you. So do some of these things. Google the person, build a map of their career, kind of see what they've given in terms of speeches and talks, see what they say on social media, and try to figure out kind of a little bit about them. Again, it doesn't take me very long anymore. Now when I prepare for a podcast interview, it takes me about 20 minutes. Very quickly, in about 20 minutes, I can get a pretty good sense of things to do a really, really great interview. But I would tell you the important thing is to go in not trying to sort of repeat what everyone else has done. Try and do something different. The best compliment you can get when you have an interview with someone is they say, wow, those are really good questions. I've never been asked that before. I've never thought about that before. That's kind of the important thing to do. So spend a few minutes preparing. And again, I would say in the first ones, it may take you a little while. But for me now, I could do it in about 15 to 20 minutes. Now, the second thing that's really important is, remember, we're doing story interviews. These are interviews where you're going to actually try and gather information so that you can extract a story. People are not very good at storytelling, so you're going to have to be listening and looking for story prompts, right? We talked about what those are. You want to basically be saying, is there someone who during this conversation said, this happened on this time, this happened in this place, and there was dialogue. Those are the three things you'll be listening for. So in some ways, when you watch people who are doing a really good job of interviewing on late night television, they always start out with, oh, so I heard your daughter went to this gymnastics session, or whatever it may be. You look for those sorts of things. And so story prompts are these sort of prompts that can get you to go where you want to go. And oftentimes, what I will tell you is when you're interviewing someone in this way, you have these ones, you may be able to prompt them with a story that they've told elsewhere. So again, going back to the story of Pixar, the founder of Pixar, if we look at his book, he talks about some stories about how they actually came up with The Incredibles. Now, The Incredibles was a really, really unique movie at the time. It had this really interesting sort of story behind it where they took all of the people who were the misfits in the entire Pixar company and they put them together on one team, which was sort of really an interesting thing. And it worked. It was one of their unique success stories behind it. And so if you think that's an interesting story and you think there's interesting elements of it, you could say, hey, listen, so I read in your book that for the Incredibles, you guys did something different. You kind of had this team of misfits. Tell me a little about the motivation behind having this team of misfits. So go into these conversations, if you can, with having 2 to 3 sort of story prompts. You don't need them to tell the whole entire real story. You could say, hey, listen, I saw that you guys sort of had this team of misfits come together. Tell me a little bit about what was it like that first meeting when you brought them all together, something in those sorts of ways. So think about how you can wind up using these story prompts to make sure that you get a story if you don't have one. So oftentimes these are some examples. In your book, you share a great story about blank. I was curious to learn more about this part of it. So that's an example of how you use the story prompt. In a podcast interview I saw you on, you told a story about how you came up with the idea for your company. I'd like to dive more into this part of it. right? So again, what you do there is you signal knowledge to them, but you also kind of then are able to go into what you want about it. Third one, I saw on social media that you recently tweeted or posted or did whatever it is. I wanted to understand about your motivations behind this particular decision. So again, you signal to them some level of light knowledge, but then you're also able to sort of kind of move past that knowledge so you don't have to have them tell it again and hear more about the clarifications. So those are the important things to sort of look for story prompts. So again, spend your 20 to 30 minutes in advance of it, build out this light secondary interview, and then try to see if you can come in with a couple story prompts that you think you might want to tell. Now, not everyone will have story prompts readily accessible. Not everyone's written a book or done a podcast interview, but most people will have something, and see if you can use those ones. So now, how do you actually do this? How do you get down and put together a really great story interview? The key targets that I would give for each of you is the rule of 3. If you come out of one of these interviews with 3 stories that you've heard in one way or another and 3 quotes, you've won. That's it. So if you've got 3 stories they tell you and 3 quotes, you've won. Now I will tell you that you've even done like a bang up job if you get 2 stories and 2 quotes. And at the end of the day, if you just get 1 story and that's it, you still have won. The reason of it is you can wind up using those sort of pieces you have to wind up helping you kind of round out the story even further. And so you may wind up have gotten a decent piece of a story or some quotes around it, but if you can pull the other stuff from the secondary interview into what you have, it can become really great. Now here's the thing that I would urge you to do. I would urge you before you sit down with an interview to pull out a white piece of paper, and I would put 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And in that one, I would be sort of having like a timestamp of when you basically went out and captured that one. So if you heard it at 2 minutes and 42 seconds, you heard them tell a great quote, awesome. Because one of the things I'll recommend to all of you to do, and we'll talk about this a little more today, is I recommend you record every single interview if you can. Now you might not always be able to. We're going to talk about a tool that will help you a little bit, but I think try to record it and timestamp it because it's a lot easier than trying to memorize these things. So, yes?
So, sorry, unfortunately I might have missed this part here. This framework is helpful for the friendlies that we're talking to as well?
This will be helpful for friendlies or non-friendlies. Yeah, so any person you're interviewing, this will be a helpful framework to use. It really is, again, I would say it this way, is you may not need to use all of these techniques if you know someone, but I'll actually tell you some interesting thing that I've seen. It's way harder to interview someone you already know. It's way harder. The reason it's way harder is because they kind of don't really want to follow your flow. They're like, oh, well, whatever, we know each other. We can skip this stuff. Let's just talk about you a little bit. And you're like, no, I want you to follow my flow, my framework. So part of it is having this framework to go into it, as we'll talk about more, can be really helpful to make sure that you sort of get out of it what you want. Friendly interviews oftentimes can be harder to get better stuff out of them than people you don't even actually know.
Would you recommend still going through, I guess, how would you go about that secondary framework if your friendly may not have material out there that you could digest?
So everyone has content out there. Unless they're not using the internet at all, they always have stuff out there. Look at their social media, right? See the things they've recently posted or tweeted. Find out what they've done already. Look at their LinkedIn. Everyone has a trail these days, and Googling someone will pull up different things. You'll be surprised at friendlies too. It's one of the interesting things you find when you do a friendly interview is actually many people have stuff out there that you didn't know. You're like, wow, I had no idea that when you were in college you did a YouTube sketch comedy show. That's super interesting, right? You learn things about people when you hunt around a bit, but I would tell you everyone has something out there. They may not have the most amazing prompts that you have, but everyone will have something. Does that make sense?